Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the last session of the day today. So we are joined by Kiah SMITH, who is running a 50-minute workshop on fair food futures. So this is about adding your voice to this. Well, I'll let Kiah explain. So yeah, really excited to hear all about it, and I'll pass over to Kiah. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Rhiannon, and thanks everyone for your patience. Interestingly, this is a workshop. It was going to be a participatory workshop, and I came along today thinking we'd have a bunch of people in the room here to do some participatory activities, which we just don't have. So thanks everyone for coming along, for all of you on Zoom, but I hope that also you can bear with us while we work out how to do what we were going to do in the room online, but let's hope it works. My name's Kiah SMITH, and I'm a sociologist at the University of Queensland, and I'm a sociologist in food and agriculture, development, environment. I do agri-food political economy, but today what I'm going to talk about is my hat as a a futurist sociologist, which is kind of a new and emerging area in sociology. Before I start, I want to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara traditional owners and the custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. And in particular, because I'm talking about food and justice, it's really important that I acknowledge and respect First Nation people's laws and their ecological sustainable custodianship of Australia over tens of thousands of years through their land and sea management practices that continue today. So, before we get there, I also just want to note that the participatory activities that we're going to try and do today, I'm going to ask you to go into a different online site, which you should still be able to do while you're in the Zoom room. We'll test that out. But just so that you know that any responses that you do put in, this is part of a larger research project. So I will be looking at those responses and hanging on to those responses as part of the research. So if you don't want any of those responses to be recorded as part of research, then don't type any in. Of course, no names are associated with it. Your names won't show up in any of the online stuff that you do. All right, before we start, it would be so nice if I could see people. Oh, here we go. I'm working out how I can see you at the same time. Before we start, I want to ask you all to stand up. Stand up where you are, off your chairs. I can't see you. It would be lovely. I know I'm seeing lots of people's names on the screen. It would be lovely if you can put your video on, even if it's just for a little tiny moment, so I can see that we've got some real people in the room. It would be good. All right, thanks, Rhiannon. So stand up. Hi, Marcus. Thanks for standing up. Okay. When you're all there, thanks everyone. We're putting cameras on. I can see there's some actual people here. This is lovely. What I want you to do first, before we start anything, is just to close your eyes. And before you close your eyes, have a look at the little quote that I've put up on the screen here, where it says, to build a better future, we must first imagine ourselves there. So what I want to ask you to do just for a couple of minutes is close your eyes. And I want you to picture a future in which there is food for everyone and where no one is hungry. So I want to close your eyes and just imagine what that looks like. What is food in your mind's eye? Where's it being grown? How's food being consumed? How's it being traded? What are we doing with the waste? What does the environment look like? So just close your eyes and imagine that picture to yourselves. Okay, you got it? Okay, you can open your eyes. So this concept or this approach of imagining what the future looks like, this is the very basis underpinning the study called Fair Food Futures that I've been working on now for a couple of years. Where are we? Come on. Okay. So this broader project that the workshop is part of today is called Fair Food Futures. And this is a part local initiative and part national research study that aims to co-create future scenarios that have food justice at their very core. And as part of this Food Futures work, what we're doing is talking to a really wide range of civil society actors in the food system. So we've been talking to people who are growing food in urban farms and we're talking to people in charity networks, we've been talking to advocates, we've been talking to researchers, we've been talking to a really broad range of food system actors, policymakers, and asking them to imagine into the future, what does a fair food future look like if we really take food justice and access to food and hunger as a serious component of addressing in the food system? Now, this broader project is action project in the sense that we've been doing lots of local case studies, we've been doing lots of participatory workshops. It's a very co-created study, but it also informs national and international work around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not going to go into that at all today, but for those of you who might have heard of them, one of the key goals at a global level is to reach zero hunger by 2030. And within this global framework, there's lots of kind of pathways or steps that are being promoted as a way to get there. Now, what we've seen in this space is really interesting, is that civil society, alternative, grassroots, food network actors don't always necessarily resonate with the types of pathways that we see in the UN Sustainable Development Goals framework, but also we see that there are lots of really exciting experiments about how to do food differently that are happening right now. So that's what this research project focuses on, exploring those experiments that we see happening on the ground today that we can learn from in terms of thinking about how might we get to these alternative futures. So in the workshop today, what I want to ask you is to tell us what needs to change to make these futures come true. And as I said, your views on the findings are going to be used to refine these scenarios and these visions before we present them to policymakers next year. There's a web link there to the Fair Food Futures website. You can take a look there. That's got all about the project and some preliminary findings you'll also see in there for now. All right, but as a really another little tiny bit of background before I get to telling you about the scenarios and some of the findings that we're already starting to see, I want to talk a little bit about these two concepts that have been driving the study. The first is this idea of food utopias, and I found it really interesting in the presentation this morning, one of the sessions early on. We're talking about this tension between understanding kind of these utopian visions of how we want the world to be and seeing that there's kind of an uncomfortableness or a tension between how do we get there, what experiments are happening. Now, food utopias is it's a sociological idea that draws on the work of also around real utopias that says that we can actually have a look at these really experiments that are happening today and see these as a glimmer of what the future might be. And the way that we can then unpack how to get there is really by having kind of a critical look at the logistical challenges around them, the challenges and opportunities associated with those types of experiments. So in my work, I use food utopias as a tool of dialogue and communication that can both recognize problems, but it also leaves hope and possibility open for discussion. So in a food utopias framework, we start to tell new stories about food, and that is really the focus of this work. The second key concept that the project works with is that of food justice. And this is an approach that seeks to ensure that the benefits and risks of where, what, and how food is grown and produced, transported and distributed and accessed and eaten are shared fairly. So in food justice, it places addressing systemic inequalities as a really central part for addressing food systems overall. So what has this research done? This scenarios research asks civil society participants from across the country to think about what is our preferred food future and how can we get there. And there are 3 steps to the methodology. I'm not going to go into this in great depth today, but just so that you know where we've come from, so that the scenarios in a minute make sense, is the first step is forecasting, and that's where we start to get some shared understandings of what fair food might mean and a shared understanding of the key drivers of change in the system. From there, we take the second step, which is visioning. And this is the really exciting, imaginative part where we get to come together, build scenarios, and we use a few different tools within that step, such as thinking about future wheels or seeds of change, which again, I won't go into now. This then brings us to the third step in making scenarios, and that's action. And there are 2 parts of this. And the first is refining the scenario, the visions that are coming out of this co-created work, and identifying how we might get there. So it's this third step that we're going to focus on today. All right, We've done quite a substantial amount of participatory research so far. Here's just some images from work that we did in Moreton Bay. We've also done workshops in Brisbane. We've done so far 2 online workshops. We did one in July, which was an introduction to civil society, and where we asked people to help us refine the types of drivers that we should be working with. We also did a recent workshop in October looking at the link between these future scenarios and sustainable development goals. And then we're actually going to be doing some more online workshops to further discuss or zoom in on some key areas that seem to be popping up in these scenarios. And we're doing those later in November and December. We've also done a bunch of case studies here in Southeast Queensland, looking at different types of experiments that fit within this Food Utopias framework. Okay, within our workshops, we ask people to envisage the future, and we use these 5 key questions to shape thinking. So we ask people to think about what is food in their scenario. How is food produced and by whom? What does food consumption look like? Where is power located in the food system, and how is food justice achieved? We use these as discussion points, and then we use these as ways to kind of create new storylines. So now I'm going to move on to the part which is going to be a little bit interesting on Zoom in this forum, but let's see how we go. We have now come out of this year of participatory work. We have 4 draft scenarios for Southeast Queensland that have been emerging. And these are fair food in the city, resilience beyond crisis, circular democracy, and the long table. Now, what I'd like to do is encourage everybody to join in this discussion now, where you're going to have a chance to see what the scenarios are and to make some comments on those scenarios by going to the Padlet. Now you can see the Padlet link here. If I just stop my share, you can also see the Padlet link has now been repasted into the chat. So there's a link there, and then there's a password. If you click on that, this is what you should see. I will try and share the screen to that as well. Where is it? Here it is. All right. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Oh, looks like half and half. Sorry, guys. I will just make that. Okay. Hopefully you can all see the Padlet screen. Yeah, Rhiannon's nodding, so that's good. All right. Now, what we're going to try and do here in our Zoom workshop is you can see here that there are 4 scenarios down the bottom that have been presented. Fair food in the city, resilience beyond crisis, circular democracy, and the long table. Now, what I'll do is I'll take a couple of minutes now just to run through the stories that are associated with each of those. But yourself, if you're online as well, you can actually scroll down each scenario. So here I'm showing you with the purple. If you scroll down, you'll see a little bit of a blurb there that gives you a really brief overview of the key focus of those scenarios. Now, what I should point out is that across all of these scenarios, there are some key things that everybody wants and that are sort of the non-negotiables for a fair food future. And a lot of those have to do with things like localizing food production consumption networks, participatory governance in how those food systems policies are actually being designed, things like circular kind of approaches to thinking about food waste, and the role of community education and the different type of actors who can take a role. So they're just a few that I can think of that really cut across all of the different scenarios. But what we've done to create 4 distinct scenarios is we've sort of zoomed around a particular focus. So if I can start first with, I'll start with the purple one because that's on your left, fair food in the city. Now, this scenario reimagines cities as places where food is grown and shared on the streets, in verge gardens, parks, backyard gardens, and community garden spaces. Food in this scenario is hyper-localized. Fresh food no longer needs to be transported long distances. The because they are grown and consumed well as automatically in this scenario is that local government town planning is committed to rethinking land access and repurposing urban space to grow more food. This, in this scenario, results in food that's healthy and affordable and often free, because food systems have been integrated with wider land use policy, climate policy, and sustainability policy more generally across the board. In this scenario, food is seen as a common good, not a commodity, although it can still generate economic benefits at the local level. I'm not going to read through the whole storyline there. These storylines will be available online on the Fair Food Futures website in future. But here I think the thing to take away is that here the emphasis is on planning for urban food systems and commoning those urban food systems. This has to do with things like rezoning urban land. And as part of that, it's also about regulating to support the types of agroecological, organic, regenerative permaculture practices and to remove some of those policy barriers that a lot of civic actors tell us are in the way of them doing this type of urban agriculture to a greater scale. We have ideas about, as I said, food being grown on the streets, in fruit trees and orchards and food forests, but also on buildings, and really thinking about using planning as a key mechanism. As part of that, as you'll see in different ways across all the scenarios, community makes land use policy, and the land use policy is really central in this scenario. If I talk really briefly about the next one, resilience beyond crisis, this scenario took as its two kind of drivers, looked at disasters and also looked at localizing food networks. So two key drivers of food system change. And as a result, in this scenario, food is seen as being equally available during a disaster or a crisis as it is in normal times. So this scenario acknowledges that although crises are going to be inevitable in the future, food systems can provide an important social and environmental buffer and are a source of transformation. In this scenario, food and diets become more diverse. Plant varieties that were thought to be extinct now fill stalls at open farmers markets, food hubs, and backyard gardens. And growing native foods is also common practice in this scenario, because this is where we're getting more resilience to the Australian climate, pests, and diseases. In this scenario, food is understood as being part of an interdependent relationship between people, the land, and ecological sensibility. If I move now over to the third one, so the green scenario, this one's called circular democracy. Just find my notes, sorry. And in this scenario, the focus is really on rethinking the economic model of growth by bringing in ideas about rights, circular economies, democratization, transparency, and participation. So in this scenario, food's being reimagined within a new economic and sociological system. Control of the food system is really placed as a key pillar of democracy. So this is where food policy is designed by and for small-scale farmers and consumers, rather than reflecting the priorities of large agribusiness. In this scenario, bad food is no longer profitable, as sustainable production and consumption models are based on radical definitions of circular economy and a degrowth mindset. Here, the culture around food is highly innovative, particularly around ways to reduce overproduction and put waste back into the food system. But the concept of innovation here is more focused on social and environmental justice than technological efficiency. So here you'll see key ideas such as technology for the people. How can we actually regulate that and make sure that technology benefits people rather than large corporations? The right to food, and participants and citizens playing a key role in regulating corporations. Finally, the fourth scenario is called the long table. And this is where really the emphasis is on hunger and the intersectionality between food and other social, economic, and environmental elements of the food system. So in this scenario, everyone is invited to share at a longer table. Food is healthy, it's local, but most importantly, it's fairly and equitably priced. Here, social movements have really succeeded in reorienting our understandings of hunger as being connected to things like income poverty, meaning that food is now a key mechanism through which we can address a wide range of other inequalities associated with things like income, housing, health, education, geographic location, and cultural background. Here, food becomes valued for more than just its nutritional content. It becomes a cultural connector for families and communities and a key part of the social welfare system, and it becomes a pathway to climate action. So here that intersectionality and diversity become key kind of focal points in the long table. Food is made accessible and affordable through both market and non-market types of strategies, but this increases options that are available for the most vulnerable people in ways that also ensure dignity, enjoyment, and cultural appropriateness. So here we see intersectional rights around labour, land, gender, indigenous rights, and health being brought together with food policy and the food system. All right, so here is where I'm going to stop talking for a little bit, and I'm going to invite you to all go into the Padlet and think about, not necessarily the scenarios themselves, although you're welcome to add comments on that, but really the question that I want to pose today is how can we actually get there to this kind of food system in the future? And some of the key elements you might like to consider is thinking about what elements currently might need to shrink or decrease in order to reach this scenario. You might want to think about what elements need to grow, or what specific policies or particular stakeholders should be targeted in getting us to that future. And here I invite you to draw on your own experiences in particular parts of the food system, because without knowing who everyone is, I'm guessing that everyone comes at an interest in food systems from different perspectives. You might be in policy, you might be in academia, you might be an activist on the ground, you might be growing food. So I urge you to think about what are the key kind of mechanisms that you're seeing in your daily work or life in the food system that might become really important levers for getting us to these futures? So what you need to do is in the Padlet, you can come down and click on, you can see here I'm hovering over this little speech bubble down the bottom here. You can click on a speech bubble and you can type something in. So for example, I can go down here into purple and I can add a comment. I might say, we need to decrease supermarket control. Okay, that's just a really broad statement, but hopefully we'll start to see comments that are coming up in the Padlet. So I'm going to stop talking for a few minutes. I'm going to let you all take some time, type something in. If you've got any comments for me as well, please feel free to wave or put something in the chat and I can answer that. But otherwise, I want to give you a little while to engage with those different scenarios. Type in your comments. Okay. I don't know. Yeah, but not if no one puts anything on there. Like no one's even, it's really, I don't even know if anyone's there because we only see one person's face.
All right, well, hopefully everyone is taking some time to think and put in the Padlet. I'm going to have a little think myself. Yeah, I'm sure Kiah will come back and let us know when our time's up, but let's see if we can contribute to this.
See that there are I can see that there are a few comments already popping up on the different scenarios. That's brilliant. Keep going. I guess at this point, I would welcome you to, if you want to put your hand up and tell us a little bit about the comments that you're making, or if you've got a reflection on any one of the scenarios, feel free to speak up. We can hear you here as well. So, or if you've got a question, otherwise just keep putting in your comments into the Padlet.
Catherine, you had something that you put into the chat. Did you want to speak to that?
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, I can see here. So Catherine, thanks, Catherine. You've written, we need to network between local food producers, community gardens, balcony growers, backyard producers sorry, playing havoc with my screen, to have representation to local government and state government. In order to ensure representation is heard, we need citizen assemblies on the ground. Yeah. Absolutely, I would absolutely agree. And I think this is that element of governance that continues to come up throughout this conversation about how do we get there. And a lot of that is about what types of participatory governance mechanisms are there that we can use. And these don't necessarily need to be recreated. There are lots of really great examples of things like citizen assemblies, food citizen panels around the world that we can model on in terms of how to do that. For example, in Canada, but also we see them increasingly, particularly in Victoria, there are some examples of these coming up. So this is absolutely an idea that keeps popping up across all the different scenarios in terms of how do we connect those different scales of transformative activity. So yeah, great point. So here's your game.
I think another one is garage sales.
Garage sales?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we could, I'm living in the country now, but the same thing applies in the city. If people can have access to actually systems of exchange between each other, food swaps are on the increase.
Yeah,
they're so important, and that can happen through garage sales. Garage sales are kind of basic democratic institution in Australia. Mm-hmm. And I think it's such a fantastic local framework that exists. I'll just give you an example. I'm living in an area where a guy set up an annual garage sale, and 15 local houses had their garage sale. And I imagine if we had a food swap at each one of those garage sales, it could easily happen, as long as, of course, we've got public health regulations that can be aligned with that, and so that councils are working with us rather than to restrict food exchange and sale by local people.
Yeah, and Catherine, that's so definitely, like in one of the scenarios, you can see on the long table one, this is where this idea of food swaps, food sharing and bartering has really been discussed in terms of these alternative economies that aren't necessarily market forms of exchange, but are based on a solidarity sharing economy model. So yeah, that absolutely comes in. But what I love about what you're proposing is to use already existing culturally kind of held mechanisms that people do. Like you said, there's this long history of having garage sales. So rather than needing to reinvent, actually to embed food into other spaces where maybe they haven't been before. But here's an example of the sharing economy that already exists. We had another chat here from Jorge, talking about edible scapes, is that food growers should pay as public service staff when the food production is in the small scale to satisfy the urgent need of more vulnerable communities. So here I think you're referring to, I guess you're saying people should be purchasing food so that surplus can then be to go to more vulnerable communities. And there's lots of good models of that as well around. I'm thinking, you know, mini farm projects here that has a economically viable urban farm that has some elements, you know, 50% of its produce go to paying customers in a box scheme, and the other 50% of its produce goes direct into food charities for vulnerable groups at no cost. So I think that, you know, that mixture of market, non-market, or financialized, non-financialized. So you're saying you think that the food grower should pay to produce the food? Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because that's quite a different approach than I think lots of people might expect the eater, the consumer, to pay for the food. So
you can see me? Hello?
Yeah,
We can hear you.
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to understand me, but yeah, the idea, or the fact, no, when we invite volunteers to produce food in a food community project, and that volunteer is actually paid by the central link to comply with hour of activity to be able to receive that income. In fact, what we are doing is to pay that people as a public service, because we use money from the community, from the social system. The same money is by other staff of social public staff I'm talking about. No, army people and politician people are paid by the accumulation of the resources of the country, and people from the central link are paid for the same money, same income. So, and when we use the people to grow food, actually we are in a direction where we help people to produce food and support the people. Should be better, should be at the level of everyone, no? So it's enough to satisfy the basic need of the food grower, no? But allow food grower on the city, especially people are have an occupation, no? And that's the transition to be occupied for something direct benefit the community.
Yeah, so this, and yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's that rethinking of who pays what, and I think it's very closely connected to that. What's the fair price for people, that fair price? So yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. All right, is there anyone else? Anyone else have any? Let me see in the chat. Any other points in the chat? What I might do is I might just go to have a look at what people might have written on some of the scenarios. So if I go here to the comment, you may or may not be able to see that. Sorry, guys. Okay. So there's lots of comments there, and you can see, I think, the comments probably if you click on the bottom as well, you should be able to see the comments on the right yourself. Lots of comments around fair food in the city, around increasing the connection between food markets and food shelters or food banks. Yeah, quite a few comments here about food banks and how they intersect with growing food in the city. A point here about logistics systems that allow people to share and trade their produce. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. Like, what are the mechanisms that we might need to enable that extra market or outside of kind of usual channels? Someone talking here about Food Connect and the work that they're doing. Yeah, I think that's really interesting point, and about Food Connect in Southeast Queensland around how their shed is connecting food sovereignty or food justice with urban and town planning. And interesting, Food Connect has been one of the case studies that we're focused on as part of the where advocacy and that role that the local food network actors, including Food Connect Shed, playing a really strong role in advocating with local councils, for example, and thinking about zoning, thinking about different ways to do planning. So yeah, it's a good point. All right, so there are lots there. I'm going to click on this one. Let's have a look at what comments might be here on the long table. Someone said that there's long table dinners in Nambour already. And yeah, and I think there's like lots of great examples of this, even like quite underground and quite grassroots examples where communities actually get together. And particularly we see this in migrant groups and refugee groups that happen all the time. But yeah, I think there's lots of ways that kind of we can expand the idea of who should access food and what are the criteria against which people need to be able to access that food. Okay, really quickly, if I can go to here. What about this one? Oh, sorry, guys. So in terms of the resilience, some people have commented saying we need more funding and subsidizing for regen practices and food co-ops, probably intersected together. Education and workshops on growing native food, things like seed sharing, seed libraries, and policies that prioritize local production and consumption and deprioritize export-oriented production. That last point I think is really interesting, and something that's come up as quite a tension across the food scenarios that we've talked about is while localization has been a really big focus, there's still a lot of kind of question about, well, what about those kind of large scale commodity food systems like wheat and sorghum and sugar, and in the sense that a lot of Australia's agricultural economy is export focused. So there does seem to be quite a tension in talking about, well, how do we localize at the same time as maybe shifting some of that emphasis away from the export production. Some of the discussion, particularly interesting, has been around the tension between urban areas that tend to talk a lot about relocalizing food and building peri-urban agriculture, putting farmers markets right near where people live, and a tension around what it actually would look like in rural and regional locations in Australia, where actually export-oriented agriculture and larger scale industrial agriculture is much more of the norm and is a key part of the fabric of those regional places. So that's another debate I think that connects here. All right, well, look, we're nearly at the time of when we need to wrap up this workshop. So I'm going to leave the Padlet now, but it is still open and I welcome you to continue to have a look at it. I'll leave it open even for the rest of this conference over the weekend, maybe until Monday, to give people time to go in there and add any other thoughts as they pop up. I'll stop sharing this one and just go to my last couple of slides just to finish off the session today. So these are the questions you talked about. How do we need to get there? So thanks. What are the next steps for the project? If you want to get involved, I would highly or strongly recommend or urge you to go and have a look at the fairfoodfutures.com website and the blog, where you can see project updates and findings and publications as they come out. We're also doing more online workshops with fair food actors across the country, and we're doing some of these later this year. You'll see over on the right, there's 2 there in December. And what we do, instead of starting from scratch, reimagining scenarios, we're actually aiming to zoom in on 2 issues that have emerged across all of them as something that we need to talk a bit more about. So one is on youth and climate action and how that fits into a future scenario. And the second is around technology for the people. So what would a fair food future look like where technology itself is being transformed into a common good and more democratically controlled? So if you're interested in either of those topics or both, please feel free to go online and register for those. We'll also be doing next year, we'll be taking these findings to a policy roundtable with policy makers from local, state and national governments, and also some international organizations. So it's quite a multi-level project. So finally, if you've got any questions, feel free to email me. I'm at UQ and would love to hear from you. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Kiah. If everyone could please give a Zoom thank you, which could look like this, or if you know where your action button is, yeah, there we go. Yeah, thank you so much for sort of facilitating the workshop and getting people, like stimulating people's thinking around this topic. And hopefully people will continue to update the Padlet, as you said, over the weekend when maybe they have a bit more time to have a little go away and think. So yeah, thanks again. So for everyone, this concludes our last session for the day. So tomorrow we kick off again at, let me just check, WA time. It's very early, but for most of you it will be 9:10 in the morning. So yeah, please make sure that you join us again tomorrow. You can catch up on other sessions later when we get them up on the website. But yeah, thanks again, Kiah, and thank you all for coming, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks all.